The small town of Ridgeville had a reputation for being quiet, a place where people's business stayed their own, and nothing ever seemed to make the news. But one scorching afternoon, something happened that would not only shake Ridgeville to its core, but ripple across the entire country. At the center of it was a man no one in town had ever seen before. He was tall, dressed in simple clothes, and carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. He wasn't from around here, that much was clear. And in a place like Ridgeville, strangers never stayed strangers for long. Officer Kevin Ross and his partner, Mike Andrews, were on patrol when they first noticed the man. He was walking down Main Street, calm and composed, drawing glances from townsfolk who rarely saw an unfamiliar face. To Ross and Andrews, the man seemed out of place. He wasn't bothering anyone, but something about him made them uneasy. Maybe it was the way he seemed too confident for a newcomer. Or maybe it was just because he didn't look like the kind of person they were used to in Ridgeville. "Let's have a little fun," Ross said, nudging his partner as they pulled their squad car over. Andrews smirked. They were bored, and boredom had a way of bringing out the worst in them. The man didn't resist as they approached him, even when their questions turned sharp and accusatory. "What are you doing here? You lost?" Ross asked, his tone dripping with condescension. The man simply smiled, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Just passing through," he replied, but his calmness only seemed to irritate them more. The situation escalated quickly. What started as a routine stop spiraled into something far darker. Ross and Andrews, emboldened by the lack of onlookers willing to intervene, decided to detain the man. It wasn't an arrest. They had no real reason to take him in. But Ridgeville wasn't the kind of place where anyone questioned the cops. The man was placed in the back of the squad car, and the officers exchanged a knowing glance. "Let's take him to the old storage lot," Ross said with a grin. The lot was a secluded area behind the station, rarely used and even less frequently checked. For them, it was the perfect spot to let off steam. When they arrived, they led the man to a rusted, empty cage that had once been used to hold stray animals. It was degrading, humiliating, and entirely unnecessary. But to Ross and Andrews, it was a game. They shoved him inside, locked the door, and stood back to enjoy their handiwork. Still feeling calm now, Andrews sneered, leaning against the cage. The man, however, didn't react the way they expected. He didn't beg, didn't plead. Instead, he sat down on the cold, hard ground, his expression as calm as ever. "You boys don't know who you're messing with," he said quietly, almost as if he were talking to himself. The officers laughed. "Oh, we know exactly who we're messing with," Ross replied, his voice dripping with mockery. But the truth was, they didn't. Not even close. Hours passed, and the man remained in the cage, silent and still. His lack of reaction began to unnerve them. "What's his deal?" Andrews muttered, glancing at Ross. "Why isn't he freaking out?" Ross shrugged, though his confidence was beginning to waver. "Probably trying to play tough," he said, though even he didn't sound convinced. What neither officer knew was that the man wasn't just any stranger passing through town. He had a purpose for being there, one that had brought him face to face with men like Ross and Andrews before. He was no ordinary man. He was a federal human rights inspector, and Ridgeville had just become the focus of an investigation that would expose far more than these officers could ever imagine. As night fell, the quiet town of Ridgeville seemed unchanged on the surface. But behind the scenes, a storm was brewing. The man in the cage wasn't done yet, and what happened next would change everything. For the officers, for the town, and for anyone who thought justice could be caged. The screen fades to black, and the suspenseful music swells. What happens when the system turns on itself? Stay tuned to find out. The night was quiet, broken only by the faint hum of insects and the occasional distant bark of a dog. Ridgeville always seemed to settle into an eerie stillness after sunset, as if the entire town agreed to go silent at once. Officer Kevin Ross leaned against the hood of his patrol car, his eyes darting toward the cage every now and then. The man inside was still sitting there, his posture relaxed and his face unreadable. There was something about his calm that Ross couldn't shake. It was like the man knew something Ross didn't. Mike Andrews paced back and forth, growing restless. "We should have gotten rid of him by now," he muttered, glancing at Ross. "This is starting to feel weird." "Relax," Ross shot back, though his voice was quieter now. "He's not going anywhere. You saw him. He didn't fight back, didn't argue. He's harmless." Andrews frowned. "Maybe. But what if he's not?" He stared at the man through the bars of the rusted cage. "What if he's one of those lawyers or something? You know, the kind that get all fired up about cops overstepping." Ross scoffed, though the thought had crossed his mind too. If he was a lawyer, he'd have been running his mouth by now. "Trust me, I've seen the type." Inside the cage, the man remained silent, his face still calm as the shadows stretched across the ground. He didn't look tired or angry. In fact, he looked like a man waiting for something. The stillness of his body, the slow rhythm of his breathing, it was unsettling. "Hey," Andrews finally barked, trying to break the silence. "You gonna sit there all night, or are you gonna say something?" The man looked up, his eyes locking onto Andrews with a calm intensity. For a split second, Andrews felt his stomach drop. The man's gaze was sharp, too sharp for someone who was supposed to be helpless. "You boys have no idea what you're doing," the man said softly. His voice was low but firm, each word precise, as if he were choosing them carefully. Ross rolled his eyes, pushing off the car. "Oh, here we go. Finally gonna lecture us." The man didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I've seen this before," he said, almost to himself. "You think no one's watching. You think you're untouchable." Andrews bristled. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means the world doesn't work the way you think it does," the man replied simply. "Eventually, people like you meet someone who fights back." Ross took a step forward, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Is that a threat?" The man's gaze didn't waver. "It's a fact." For a moment, there was silence again. The only sound was the soft creak of the cage as the man shifted his weight slightly. Ross felt his pulse quicken. He wasn't sure why this stranger's words were getting under his skin, but they were. He could feel his patience wearing thin, like a rope fraying at the edges. Andrews pulled Ross aside, lowering his voice. "Listen, maybe we should just let him go. Call it a night. No harm, no foul." Ross shook his head stubbornly. "And let him walk out of here like nothing happened. No way. You want to explain to the chief why we brought a guy in and then just turned him loose." Andrews hesitated, glancing back at the cage. "I don't know, man. Something feels off. I don't think this guy's just some random nobody." Ross didn't want to hear it. He was in too deep now, and backing down would feel like losing control. He walked up to the cage again, leaning in close. "So what's your deal?" he demanded. "You some kind of drifter, a con man. What are you really doing in Ridgeville?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied Ross carefully, like he was sizing him up. "You'll find out soon enough," he said finally. Ross felt a chill crawl up his spine, though he didn't show it. He wasn't used to feeling this unsettled, especially not by someone he had locked up. There was something about the man's calm, the quiet confidence in his voice, that made Ross feel like he was the one in a cage. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Meanwhile, across town, the lights were still on at a small diner that sat at the edge of Ridgeville. It was the kind of place where locals gathered for coffee and gossip, where the waitresses knew everyone's name and their usual order. But tonight, there was a stranger sitting at the corner booth, a woman in her late 40s, dressed in a neat blazer and holding a notebook in her lap. Her name was Evelyn Marks, and she wasn't in Ridgeville for the coffee. Evelyn was a federal investigator, a senior inspector for the Human Rights Commission. She had been sent to Ridgeville after receiving several anonymous complaints about the police force. The complaints were vague, but troubling enough to warrant a closer look. Most towns like Ridgeville operated under the radar, and that made them dangerous. Small towns could hide big secrets. Evelyn had spent the day quietly observing, listening, and taking notes. Ridgeville seemed normal enough on the surface: polite people, tidy streets, and a general air of small-town charm. But Evelyn had been doing this long enough to know that appearances could be deceiving. Something felt off here, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. As she sipped her coffee, Evelyn's phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from her colleague, a simple update. Asterisk, have you found him yet? Asterisk. She stared at the words for a moment, then typed back, asterisk, not yet. But I will. Asterisk, the man she was looking for was a fellow inspector who had gone off the radar. He had been in Ridgeville on assignment, but he hadn't checked in for over 24 hours. That wasn't like him. He was thorough, disciplined, and always on schedule. Evelyn knew something was wrong. As she sat there, staring out the diner window at the quiet streets, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Ridgeville was hiding something, and whatever it was, she was determined to uncover it. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Back at the storage lot, Ross and Andrews were still watching the man in the cage, though their confidence was starting to crack. We can't keep him here all night, Andrews said, his voice low. Someone's gonna notice he's missing. Ross scowled, running a hand through his hair. Fine, we'll move him in the morning, but I'm not letting him walk. As the two officers argued, the man in the cage sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He could hear the faint sounds of the town settling into its usual nighttime routine. Doors closing, lights flicking off, cars rumbling down distant roads. But he knew that this was the calm before the storm. The man had seen it all before: abuse of power, unchecked authority, people who thought they could get away with anything because no one was watching. But someone asterisk was asterisk watching, and he had been sent to Ridgeville for a reason. In the quiet darkness, the man reached into his pocket, pulling out a small badge. It was sleek, unassuming, but the weight of it was undeniable. The badge was a symbol of his authority, his mission. He held it in his hand for a moment, then tucked it back into his pocket, his expression unreadable. Tomorrow, everything would change, and Ridgeville would never be the same. The moon was high now, casting pale light over Ridgeville, but it did little to soften the unease hanging in the air. Inside the rusted cage, the man leaned his head back against the cold metal, staring at the dark sky above. He looked calm, but his mind was working. He was running through everything he had seen since arriving in Ridgeville: the quiet tension of the town, the nervous glances, the way people seemed to avoid eye contact with the police. He had been to places like this before, towns where silence was its own language, where people kept their heads down because they knew what happened when you didn't. Ross and Andrews sat a short distance away, muttering to each other in low voices. Their arrogance was starting to crack, their earlier confidence giving way to confusion. It was as if the man's silence had become louder than any words he could have spoken. "You sure no one saw us take him?" Andrews asked, his voice uncertain. Ross shot him a look. "How many times do I have to tell you? no one cares. It's Ridgeville. People don't ask questions here. Andrews looked away, shaking his head. Yeah, well, it's not Ridgeville I'm worried about anymore. What if he's important? What if someone's looking for him? Ross opened his mouth to answer, but stopped. The thought had been gnawing at him too, though he wouldn't admit it. He pulled his phone out of his pocket, staring at the screen. No missed calls, no texts, just silence. Normally, silence meant safety, but tonight it felt different. He thought about calling the chief, but what would he say? That they locked up a man for no good reason. He could already hear the chief's voice in his head, angry, disappointed. No, Ross decided. They'd deal with it in the morning. Back in the cage, the man could hear every word they were saying, their voices carrying in the stillness. They didn't know who he was, not yet. But they would. He had already sent a signal when they weren't paying attention. It wasn't much, just a discreet ping from his phone before they'd taken it. Enough to let someone know his location. Now it was only a matter of time. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. At the diner, Evelyn Marks tapped her pen against her notebook, staring at the half-empty coffee cup in front of her. The clock on the wall ticked quietly, each second stretching longer than the last. Something wasn't adding up. She had checked the hotels, the gas stations, the usual places where someone passing through might leave a trace. But no one had seen her colleague. It was like he had disappeared into thin air. Evelyn's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a location ping. Brief, but enough to catch her attention. She stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. The signal was coming from an area just outside of town. Her colleague had been there, or maybe he was still there. She didn't waste any time. She grabbed her keys, slipped her notebook into her bag, and walked out of the diner, leaving a crumpled bill on the table. The streets were empty as Evelyn drove through Ridgeville, the headlights cutting through the darkness. She turned down an old road that led to the back of the police station, a place she wouldn't have thought to check before. The lot was secluded, hidden behind tall fences, and dimly lit by a single street lamp. As she approached, her instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right. She parked her car a short distance away and got out, moving quietly. She could see two figures standing near a car, their voices carrying faintly through the night. And then she saw it, a cage, sitting there like it had no business being there, and inside it a man. Evelyn's chest tightened as she moved closer, keeping to the shadows. From this distance, she couldn't see the man's face, but she knew it had to be him. Her heart pounded in her chest. What had they done? Who were these officers? And how far had they gone? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Inside the cage, the man noticed the faint movement in the distance. A flicker of motion, almost imperceptible, but enough to confirm what he had been waiting for. Someone had found him. He stayed still, not wanting to tip off Ross and Andrews just yet. Time was on his side now. Ross's phone buzzed suddenly, breaking the quiet. He frowned, pulling it out of his pocket. It was a message from dispatch. Asterisk, all units check in. Federal inquiry officer reported missing. Potential investigation incoming. Asterisk. Ross's face paled as he read the words. He glanced at Andrews, who caught the look and stepped closer. What is it? He whispered. Ross hesitated, then showed him the message. Andrews' face fell. Federal, he muttered. You think it's him? Ross didn't answer. He didn't have to. The timing, the silence, the man's calm, it all made sense now. They hadn't picked up some random drifter. They had picked up someone they never should have touched. What do we do? Andrews asked, his voice trembling now. Ross looked back at the cage, where the man still sat quietly, watching them with that same unnerving calm. He felt the weight of it now, the realization of what they had done pressing down on him like a stone. "We let him out," Ross said finally, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. "We let him out, and we hope to God he doesn't." Before Ross could finish, the sound of footsteps broke through the air. Both men turned sharply, their hands instinctively reaching for their belts. A figure stepped out of the darkness, illuminated by the pale light from the street lamp. It was Evelyn. "Step away from the cage," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Ross froze, his mind racing. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. Evelyn didn't flinch. "Federal Human Rights Commission. Inspector Evelyn Marks." "I'm here for him," she said, pointing to the cage. "And you two are going to explain exactly what's going on here." Andrews took a step back, his face paling. We did," he stammered, but Evelyn's sharp glare silenced him. Ross, on the other hand, wasn't ready to back down. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. He was acting suspicious. "We were just doing our job." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Your job? Locking a man in a cage in the middle of the night?" She stepped closer, her tone growing colder. "I've seen abuse of power before, but this? You've crossed a line." The man inside the cage slowly stood up, his calm expression unshaken. "Took you long enough," he said, his voice cutting through the air like ice. Evelyn glanced at him, relief flickering across her face. "Are you okay?" He nodded, his gaze never leaving Ross and Andrews. "I'm fine, but they're not." Ross's jaw tightened as the reality of the situation set in. This wasn't a game anymore. The man they had mocked, humiliated, and locked up for their own amusement was now the one holding all the cards. And they knew it. The sound of sirens echoed faintly in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Evelyn stepped back, her eyes on Ross and Andrews. "You're done," she said quietly. "Both of you." Ross didn't say a word. He couldn't. He just stood there, his face pale as the sirens grew louder, the flashing lights reflecting off the cage where it had all started. The man stepped out as Evelyn unlocked the door, his movements slow and deliberate. He took one last look at the two officers, his calm demeanor unbroken. "You thought no one was watching," he said softly. "But someone always is." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Ross and Andrews standing there, the weight of their actions finally crashing down on them. The sirens grew louder, the wail slicing through the heavy night air like a warning. Red and blue lights flashed against the empty lot, painting streaks of color across the rusted cage and the pale faces of Ross and Andrews. They stood frozen, caught between panic and disbelief. Ross had always believed he could control any situation. He was the law in Ridgeville, after all. But now, with the arrival of other officers and federal agents, that sense of control was slipping through his fingers like sand. Evelyn stood to the side, her phone in hand, issuing quiet instructions to someone on the other end. Her calm efficiency only added to Ross's growing sense of doom. It was happening too fast, like a dam breaking, and there was nothing he could do to stop the flood. The man, still unnamed, still unnervingly calm, stood just a few feet away, watching the scene unfold with the quiet patience of someone who already knew how this would end. Even surrounded by flashing lights and the presence of armed officers, he looked completely unshaken, like this was all part of a plan he'd mapped out long before setting foot in Ridgeville. Two squad cars pulled up, gravel crunching under the tires, and more officers stepped out. Some were from Ridgeville, others clearly not, men in crisp uniforms with unfamiliar patches on their shoulders. Andrews leaned toward Ross, his voice shaking. "What do we do? What do we say?" Ross didn't answer. His mind was racing, clawing for a way out, a way to take control of the situation again. But there wasn't one. The truth was simple, unavoidable. They had taken things too far, and now they were going to pay for it. Evelyn stepped forward, her gaze steady and unflinching. "Officers Ross and Andrews," she said firmly, "I need you both to step aside. We're taking over this investigation." Ross's jaw tightened. "What investigation?" he snapped, trying to sound indignant, though his voice wavered. "There's nothing to investigate here. We detained someone who looked suspicious. That's not a crime." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Suspicious?" she echoed, her tone sharp. "Is that what you call locking a man in a cage and leaving him there like an animal? Without cause, without due process? I don't think your department handbook would agree." Her words cut through Ross's defenses like a blade. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. Behind him, Andrews shifted nervously, looking like he wanted to disappear. The sirens had stopped now, but the silence was worse. The attention of every officer, every agent, was on Ross and Andrews. They were being judged by their peers, by the system, by the very man they had underestimated. Evelyn's voice softened slightly, though it lost none of its weight. "Do you even know who he is?" she asked quietly, nodding toward the man. "Or did you just assume you could get away with this because no one was watching?" Ross's face burned, but he didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth hung heavy in the air. They had seen a man who didn't look like he belonged, and they'd let their arrogance take over. They hadn't asked questions. They hadn't cared who he might be. The man stepped forward now, his calm presence commanding attention. Every eye turned to him. "Let me answer that," he said, his voice low but clear. "My name is Daniel Pierce. I'm a federal human rights inspector, and I came to Ridgeville because I'd heard this town had a problem. I didn't expect to become part of the evidence." A ripple of quiet shock moved through the crowd. Some of the Ridgeville officers exchanged uneasy glances, suddenly aware of how deeply their department's reputation was on the line. Others, particularly those from outside agencies, nodded quietly, as if Daniel's words confirmed what they already suspected. Ross's mouth opened slightly, as though he might argue, but he had nothing left to say. The pieces were all falling into place now. The anonymous complaints, the unannounced visit. Daniel hadn't been passing through at all. He had been there to observe, to investigate. And Ross and Andrews had walked straight into a trap of their own making. Daniel turned his gaze back to Ross and Andrews, his expression calm but unrelenting. "This wasn't just about me," he said. "It's about the people in this town who don't feel safe, who don't speak up because they know no one will listen. You thought no one was watching, but they were. They always are." The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. Evelyn stepped forward again, her voice firm. "Officers Ross and Andrews, as of this moment, you're both relieved of duty pending a full investigation. I suggest you don't say another word without representation." Andrews let out a quiet, shaky breath, his face pale and clammy. Ross's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't argue. He knew it was over. His mind raced as he imagined the fallout, his career, his reputation, everything he'd built, slipping away because of one night's arrogance. He thought he had control. He thought he could make the rules. But now he realized he was nothing more than another name on a long list of men who had underestimated the wrong person. The other officers began to move now, quietly taking Ross and Andrews aside. The lot felt different suddenly, less like the quiet, forgotten corner it had been and more like the epicenter of something far bigger than anyone could have anticipated. Daniel stood to the side, watching as the officers were led away. His calm never wavered, though there was a flicker of something else in his expression, something close to sadness. Evelyn walked up to him, her voice softer now. "You okay?" Daniel nodded. "I've seen worse." Evelyn sighed. "Doesn't mean it's right." Daniel didn't answer. He looked out at the lot, at the cage sitting there like a monument to everything that had gone wrong. "They think they can get away with it because most of the time, they do," he said quietly. "But not this time." Evelyn watched him for a moment, then nodded. "We'll make sure of that." The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the lot as the officers prepared to leave, their work here only just beginning. The flashing lights threw long, jagged shadows across the ground as Daniel and Evelyn stood there in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. For Ridgeville, the night wasn't over yet. Word of what had happened here would spread, and when it did, everything would change. People would ask questions. They would demand answers. And the cracks that had always existed beneath the surface of the town would finally be exposed. For the first time in a long time, the silence would be broken. Daniel glanced at the cage one last time before turning away. It was empty now, but its presence lingered like a stain, a reminder of how easily power could be abused when no one was watching. Except someone had been watching. And tonight, justice had begun to turn its gaze on Ridgeville. As Daniel and Evelyn walked toward the waiting cars, the lot fell silent once more. But it wasn't the silence of a quiet town settling in for the night. It was the silence of a storm gathering strength, of secrets rising to the surface, ready to shatter everything they touched. And in that silence, the tension held, tight and unrelenting, because everyone knew the worst was yet to come. As the last squad car pulled away, taking Ross and Andrews with it, the lot fell eerily silent. The rusted cage sat empty under the pale light, but its presence lingered like a scar. Daniel stood for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, before Evelyn placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. "Come on," she said softly. "We'll sort this out back at the station." Daniel nodded, though his gaze stayed fixed on the cage, as if something still lingered there, something unfinished. With a quiet exhale, he turned and followed her toward the waiting vehicle. Evelyn glanced at him as they walked, searching his face for answers. "You sure you're all right?" she asked again. Daniel offered her a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine," he said, "but this isn't over. Not yet." The drive back to Ridgeville's main police station was quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. Evelyn kept her eyes on the road, her mind racing with everything that had unfolded. She had seen misconduct before, abuse of power hidden under small-town charm, but this felt different. It felt bigger asterisk. Something about Ridgeville didn't sit right with her, and Daniel's calm silence only deepened her unease. When they arrived at the station, the night shift officers barely glanced up as Daniel and Evelyn walked in. Ridgeville's department was small, its halls dimly lit and quiet. The chief's office light was on, though an unexpected sight at this hour. Evelyn exchanged a glance with Daniel before they headed toward it. The door was slightly ajar, and the sound of low voices carried out into the hallway. Inside, Chief Raymond Bennett sat behind his cluttered desk, his thick hands clasped tightly together as he listened to a man standing across from him. The man was tall and sharply dressed, his suit immaculate, his presence radiating authority. Daniel stopped mid-step when he saw him, his calm expression flickering for the first time. The man turned slowly, his sharp features catching the light. "Pierce," he said, his tone clipped and professional. "I wasn't expecting you to turn up here tonight." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I could say the same to you." Evelyn's brow furrowed as she looked between them. "You two know each other." The man smiled faintly, though it didn't feel warm. "We're colleagues of sorts," he replied. "Victor Hale, Internal Affairs Division." Evelyn's stomach dropped at the words. Internal affairs. Their presence usually meant one of two things: sweeping reforms or a deeper problem that needed burying. Victor's calm demeanor and perfectly tailored suit suggested the latter. Chief Bennet stood now, his expression unreadable as he looked at Evelyn. "Inspector Marks," he said gruffly, as though acknowledging her presence was a formality. "Mr. Hale was just briefing me on the next steps." "Next steps?" Evelyn asked sharply. "This isn't Ridgeville's investigation to manage anymore. The Human Rights Commission." Victor held up a hand, silencing her smoothly. "With all due respect, Inspector, we're aware of the situation. And while your department's involvement has been appreciated, Internal Affairs has jurisdiction now." Daniel stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "That's not how this works, Victor. You know it. I filed the investigation. The commission owns it." Victor turned his sharp gaze on Daniel. "You've done your part. Now it's time to let us handle the fallout." Daniel's fists clenched at his sides, and Evelyn could feel the tension rolling off him like heat. Something was wrong. She could sense it. Victor's arrival felt too convenient, too orchestrated. "And what exactly does fallout mean?" Daniel asked, his voice edged with quiet anger. Victor smiled faintly. "It means Ridgeville's issues will be resolved quickly and quietly. The officers responsible are already in custody. There's no need for this to escalate further." "Escalate?" Evelyn said sharply, her eyes narrowing. "You think locking someone in a cage for sport doesn't deserve escalation." Victor's smile didn't waver, but the chill behind his eyes deepened. "Let's not get emotional, Inspector Marks. The system works best when we don't make spectacles out of situations like these." Daniel's voice broke through, sharper now. "This isn't a spectacle, Victor. This is accountability. What happened here isn't an isolated incident. I came to Ridgeville because there's a pattern, complaints, people too afraid to speak out, cover-ups. Ross and Andrews were just the tip of the iceberg." Victor's smile vanished, his expression hardening. For the first time, the polished professionalism slipped, revealing something colder. "Careful, Daniel," he said quietly. "Accusations like that have consequences." The words hung heavy in the air, and Evelyn felt the shift in the room. Victor wasn't here to uncover the truth. He was here to bury it. The realization settled like a weight in her chest. Ridgeville wasn't just another small town with bad cops. There was something deeper here, something powerful enough to warrant Internal Affairs swooping in to silence it. Daniel stepped forward, his gaze locked on Victor. "You think you can control this, but you can't," he said. "Not this time. People are watching now. Ridgeville's not going to disappear into silence." Victor held his gaze for a long moment, the tension thick enough to cut. Then, without another word, he turned back to Chief Bennet. "You'll cooperate fully with Internal Affairs," he said smoothly. "We'll ensure this is handled efficiently." Chief Bennet nodded stiffly, though his eyes flickered toward Daniel and Evelyn for just a second, almost as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. Victor looked at Evelyn now, his tone final. "Your role here is done, Inspector Marks. I suggest you both leave Ridgeville tonight." Evelyn opened her mouth to argue, but Daniel touched her arm lightly, stopping her. "It's okay," he said softly. "We'll leave." She stared at him, disbelief flashing across her face. "Daniel." "Trust me," he said, his voice low. There was something in his tone, something she couldn't argue with. Victor watched them for a moment longer, as if making sure they understood, before turning back to Bennet. Evelyn and Daniel stepped out of the office, the door clicking shut behind them. In the hallway, Evelyn spun on him. "What was that? Why did you let him shut us down? Daniel's expression was grim, his jaw tight. Because he's not shutting us down. What do you mean? She demanded. He glanced back at the chief's office door, his voice barely above a whisper. Victor's here to bury the truth. Whatever's happening in Ridgeville, it goes higher than Ross and Andrews. And now we know Internal Affairs is protecting it. Evelyn stared at him, realization dawning. You think it's a cover-up? Daniel nodded. I don't think. I know. And if Victor's here, it means we're closer to the truth than we realized. Evelyn let out a slow breath, her mind racing. So what now? Daniel's eyes darkened, his calm exterior slipping just enough to reveal the determination beneath. Now we dig deeper. Ridgeville's hiding something, and we're going to find it. But we're running out of time. The two of them walked quickly through the empty halls, the echoes of their footsteps following them. Outside, the night was dark and silent, but something had changed. The stakes were higher now, the danger closer. Ridgeville wasn't just a town with dirty cops. It was part of something much bigger, something powerful enough to silence anyone who got too close. And Daniel knew one thing for certain. The closer they got to the truth, the harder Ridgeville would fight to keep its secrets buried. The cold air hit them as Daniel and Evelyn stepped out of the station, their breath visible in the dim glow of the parking lot lights. Evelyn glanced at him, her face tight with concern. We can't just let this go. If Victor's here to cover this up, Ridgeville will go right back to the way it was. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He walked to the edge of the lot, staring out at the quiet streets of Ridgeville. The stillness felt deceptive now, like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for what came next. He doesn't know we're already ahead of him, Daniel said finally, his voice low. Evelyn frowned. What do you mean? Daniel turned to her, his expression sharp. Before they took my phone, I sent evidence out, reports, names, patterns. Not just to the commission. I sent it to journalists, advocacy groups, anyone who wouldn't be afraid to ask questions. Victor thinks he's shutting this down, but he's too late. Evelyn stared at him, processing his words. So even if we're forced out, the story's already out there. Daniel nodded. The more they try to bury this, the harder it'll be for them to hide. But we're not leaving yet. Not without finishing what we started. As they got into Evelyn's car, Daniel's phone, a replacement Evelyn had given him, buzzed softly. He checked the screen, his eyes narrowing. It was a text message. Asterisk meet me. Abandoned mill. Midnight. You need to see this. Asterisk. Evelyn leaned over, her brow furrowing. Who's that from? Daniel hesitated. I don't know, but someone wants us to know more. Evelyn's expression darkened. It's a trap. You know that, right? Maybe, Daniel replied, his voice steady. But it's the only lead we have left. The car hummed as Evelyn drove through Ridgeville's empty streets, the old mill sitting on the edge of town like a forgotten relic. Its silhouette loomed against the dark sky, broken windows catching faint glimpses of moonlight. The place was abandoned years ago, and most of Ridgeville seemed to pretend it didn't exist. Evelyn parked just outside the rusted gates. You sure about this? She asked quietly. Daniel glanced at her, his calm expression unwavering. We need to know what they're hiding. They stepped out, their footsteps echoing against the cracked concrete as they moved carefully through the shadows. The air inside the mill was heavy and stale, the scent of rust and decay lingering in every corner. A faint beam of light shone from deeper within, a flashlight or maybe something more. Daniel held up a hand, signaling Evelyn to stop. Someone's here, he whispered. They moved quietly, following the faint light until they reached a large open space where the old machinery had been left to rot. Standing in the center of the room was Chief Bennett. His face was pale, his posture tense. In one hand, he held an old leather file, its edges worn as though it had been handled 1,000 times. Daniel stepped into the light. "You wanted to see me." Bennett turned, startled at first, then resigned. He looked older somehow, as though years had settled onto his shoulders in an instant. "You shouldn't have come here," he said quietly. Evelyn frowned, stepping closer. "What is this, Chief? What's in that file?" Bennett's hand trembled slightly as he held it out to Daniel. "The truth," he said, his voice hollow. "The truth I've been trying to bury for years." Daniel took the file, flipping it open. Inside were old reports, photographs, and depositions, evidence of misconduct going back decades. Officers abusing their power, falsifying records, intimidating witnesses. Names were blacked out, but patterns emerged. Complaints silenced, cases ignored, people disappearing when they spoke up. And at the heart of it all was Ridgeville's police department, protected by powerful hands reaching far beyond the town limits. Evelyn's face hardened as she scanned the pages. This isn't just a few bad cops. This goes all the way to internal affairs, doesn't it? Bennett nodded slowly. "Victor Hale isn't here to clean this up. He's here to protect it. Ridgeville is just one piece of a bigger machine. People like Ross and Andrews, they're disposable, replaceable. But if the machine keeps running, no one will ever stop it." Daniel's eyes locked on Bennett. "Why now? Why give this to us?" Bennett looked down, guilt etched into his features. "Because I've been part of it for too long, and I can't live with it anymore." He glanced toward the shadows, his voice dropping. "But I'm not the only one here tonight." Before Daniel could react, the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the mill. From the darkness stepped Victor Hale, his calm facade replaced by something sharper, more dangerous. Behind him were two men, officers Daniel didn't recognize, dressed in black and holding batons at their sides. Victor's smile returned, but this time it was ice cold. "I warned you, Pierce. Some doors shouldn't be opened." Evelyn stepped forward, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone. "This is over, Victor. We have the file, we have the evidence." Victor shook his head slowly. "Evidence only matters if someone's willing to listen." He gestured to his men. "Take it from them." The two officers moved forward, their steps quick and deliberate. Daniel shoved the file into Evelyn's hands. "Run," he shouted. Evelyn hesitated for only a second before turning and bolting toward the exit, clutching the file tightly. Daniel turned to face Victor's men, his expression hard. One of them lunged, but Daniel sidestepped, knocking the man off balance and sending him crashing to the ground. The other swung his baton, grazing Daniel's shoulder. Pain shot through him, but he gritted his teeth and pushed forward, grappling with the officer. "Get the file," Victor shouted, his voice echoing through the mill. Evelyn burst through the front doors, her breath ragged as she sprinted for the car. She fumbled with the keys, her heart pounding in her ears. She could hear footsteps behind her, getting closer. She threw the door open, sliding into the driver's seat and slamming the lock. Just as a shadow reached the window, she started the engine, tires screeching against the gravel as she tore out of the lot. Back inside, Daniel was on his knees, blood trickling from a cut on his temple. Victor stood over him, his expression unreadable. "You don't understand, Pierce," he said softly. "People like me, we don't lose." Daniel looked up, his breathing heavy but steady. "You already have. The truth's out." Victor's eyes narrowed as realization set in. Somewhere in the distance, fate sirens began to wail, getting louder, closer. Evelyn had made it out. Victor stepped back, his calm shattering as the approaching sirens pierced the air. "You're done," Daniel said quietly, pushing himself to his feet. Victor said nothing, his jaw tight as the sound of cars surrounded the mill. Flashing lights flooded the broken windows as agents and officers poured inside, their voices calling out commands. Evelyn stood near the cars, the file clutched in her hand as she watched Victor being led away, his expression a mask of fury and defeat. Daniel emerged a moment later, bruised but alive, his calm finally cracking into a faint smile. "It's over," Evelyn said softly as he approached. Daniel nodded, looking back at the mill one last time. "Almost." She frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel turned to her, his voice steady but grim. "We stopped Ridgeville, but this machine doesn't end here." The sirens faded as the night settled again, but this time, Ridgeville wouldn't fall back into silence. The truth was out, and there was no burying it now. For the first time in a long time, someone had fought back and won. Or so they thought. From somewhere deep in the shadows, unseen eyes watched the scene unfold. A quiet hum of a phone broke the silence as a message was sent. Asterisk Ridgeville compromised. Move the operation. Asterisk. The mill sat empty again, its silence swallowing the echoes of what had happened just hours before. Ridgeville's night had turned into morning, the first faint glow of sunlight stretching across the horizon. Outside the mill, flashing lights and a flurry of activity had faded, replaced now by a quieter hum of cleanup and documentation. Victor Hale was in custody, his men taken alongside him, their cover-up operation crumbling. But Daniel knew the fight wasn't really over, not yet. Evelyn leaned against the hood of her car, her arms crossed tightly as she watched federal agents move in and out of the scene, carrying evidence boxes and bags. The old leather file sat securely inside her car, its contents now the centerpiece of what was sure to become a national investigation. Her gaze flicked to Daniel, who stood nearby talking to a federal officer. Bruised, bloodied, and visibly exhausted, he still managed to stand tall, his voice calm and steady as he explained what had happened. When he finished, the officer nodded, offering him a brief handshake before walking away. Daniel turned toward Evelyn, his step slow, his exhaustion finally showing. He sank against the car beside her, letting out a heavy breath as he stared at the pale blue sky above them. "It's over," Evelyn said softly, though her tone held more relief than conviction. Daniel shook his head faintly. No, this was just the beginning. Evelyn glanced at him, frowning. Victor's been arrested. The file's out. Ridgeville will never be the same. Isn't that enough? Daniel sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. It's a start, but you saw the file. Ridgeville's just one small part of a bigger problem. How many other towns are out there? How many more cover-ups are happening right now because someone like Victor's pulling the strings? Evelyn fell silent, the weight of his words settling over her. She knew he was right. This wasn't an isolated case. It never was. Ridgeville was a symptom of something deeper, something more widespread. But at least now, this silence had been broken. The file was proof. People would listen. "So what happens now?" she asked quietly. Daniel turned his gaze toward the empty mill. "We follow it. Every lead, every name in that file. We make sure this doesn't get buried again." Evelyn smiled faintly, though there was a sadness to it. "You're relentless, you know that." Daniel shrugged, a ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. Someone has to be. For a while, neither of them said anything. The town of Ridgeville was just beginning to wake up, unaware of how much had changed overnight. But soon, the news would spread. People would know. The silence that had protected the guilty for so long was broken now, and in its place came whispers of justice. A black sedan pulled up to the edge of the lot, its engine idling softly. A familiar figure stepped out. It was one of the lead federal agents on the case, a tall woman with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority. She walked over to them, a file folder in hand. "We're taking Victor and his men back to headquarters," she said briskly. "The file you recovered, it's standing, no question about it. Internal affairs has been compromised for years, and Ridgeville's police department is just one of many on our radar now." Evelyn straightened. "What about Chief Bennett?" The agent's expression shifted slightly, as though weighing her words carefully. "He's cooperating," she said finally. "He gave us the file and turned himself in. He'll still face charges, but his cooperation might mean a lighter sentence." Daniel nodded slowly. "And Ridgeville." "We're sending a temporary oversight team," the agent replied. "The department will be restructured, top to bottom. The bad actors will be removed, and the rest will be retrained under federal supervision." She hesitated for just a moment. "Your work here made that possible. You both did more than most people would have dared." Evelyn gave a small nod, glancing at Daniel. "He doesn't know how to quit." The agent smiled faintly before turning back toward the sedan. "Keep an eye on your inbox," she said over her shoulder. "You'll be hearing from us." As the car pulled away, Evelyn let out a long breath, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in hours. "I can't believe it's over," she said softly, looking out at the empty lot. Daniel pushed off the car, his movements slow and careful. "It's not over," he said, "but it's a step in the right direction." They drove back to town as the sun rose higher, painting Ridgeville in a warm, golden light that felt almost ironic. For so long, the town had hidden its secrets in the shadows, but now those shadows were finally lifting. The main street was beginning to stir, shopkeepers unlocking their doors, kids on bikes pedaling past with laughter. To the people of Ridgeville, it was just another day. But Daniel knew it wasn't. Nothing would ever be the same again. When they reached the diner on the edge of town, Evelyn parked the car, and they stepped inside. It was quiet, the early morning crowd still sparse. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, gave them a nod as they settled into a corner booth. "Rough night?" she asked, pouring 2 mugs of steaming coffee. "You could say that," Evelyn replied with a tired smile. As the waitress left, Evelyn turned to Daniel, watching him carefully. He sat across from her, his fingers wrapped around the coffee mug, his expression distant. "You think this file's enough to change things?" she asked. Daniel looked up at her, his gaze steady. "It's a start," he said quietly. "People can't ignore it now. Ridgeville will be a lesson, proof that silence doesn't protect you forever." Evelyn nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. "And what about you? Where do you go from here?" Daniel smiled faintly, though it was tinged with weariness. "Wherever the truth takes me." She laughed softly. "You really don't know how to stop, do you?" He shook his head. "Stopping's not an option. Not until someone makes sure this doesn't happen again." Outside the diner, the morning light streamed through the windows, warming the space. It felt calm, peaceful, but Evelyn knew Daniel was already thinking ahead, already planning his next move. The fight wasn't over for him. It never would be. As they sat there, the rest of Ridgeville began to wake up, unaware that the town's long-buried secrets were about to come crashing to the surface. News vans would arrive. Reporters would ask questions. And the people who had been too afraid to speak for so long would finally have their voices heard. Daniel glanced out the window, his expression thoughtful as he watched a group of kids playing on the sidewalk. "The next time someone thinks no one's watching," he said softly, "they'll remember Ridgeville." Evelyn smiled, following his gaze. And they'll know better. For the first time since this began, Daniel let himself relax, just for a moment. Ridgeville's story was over, but its message was only beginning. The truth had a way of spreading, and now there was no stopping it.